Some tribes were destroyed in war, others were destroyed in process, through treaties, through dependence, through relocation, through silence. This is the untold truth of a tribe America tried to erase. Subscribe to Fragments of History. Leave a like if you're drawn to the hidden side of history, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. There is a moment in every expansion when people stop being people. They become obstacles, not enemies necessarily, not threats in the way an opposing army is a threat, but impediments, complications, bodies and borders standing between a nation and what it has decided it needs. And once that shift happens, once a population is reframed as a problem rather than a presence, the logic of removal stops feeling like a choice. It starts to feel inevitable. This is the story of how that happened to a tribe in America, not through a single battle, not through one decisive war, but through a systematic transformation. A people turned into a problem, then a problem addressed through erasure. It began with expansion. In the early decades of American independence, the young nation faced a reality it could not admit without undermining its own story. It had declared itself sovereign over vast territories. But those territories were not empty. They were inhabited by nations that had lived there for centuries. Nations with their own governance, trade networks, spiritual practices, and territorial claims. The United States did not treat those claims as legitimate, not because they were non-existent, but because acknowledging them would have been inconvenient. Recognition would have meant limits, boundaries, restraint. Expansion required land, and land occupied by indigenous nations could not be settled by American farmers, mined by American companies, or carved into American states on American timelines. So those nations became problems. The language shifted first, quietly, then everywhere. They were no longer sovereign peoples. They were described as uncivilized, savage, wandering tribes with no real attachment to the land they lived on. This was not careless vocabulary. It was groundwork. Because if a people are uncivilized, they can be civilized, which justifies intervention. If they are savages, they can be tamed, which justifies control. If they have no attachment to land, they can be moved, which justifies relocation. A political conflict was rewritten into a moral mission. Settlers moving west were not framed as invaders. They were pioneers, bringers of progress. Their arrival was not displacement, it was settlement. And settlement in the national narrative was not merely permitted. It was portrayed as a right, sometimes even a duty. But settlement required space, and space required the removal of whoever was already there. This is where the tribe enters the story. Not as aggressors, not as a military threat marching on cities, but as people living on land that had been marked, on maps, in speeches, in private plans, for American expansion, and that designation alone made them expendable. They had survived for generations in a region rich with resources, rivers for fishing, forests for hunting, fertile land for agriculture. They had established trade relationships with neighboring tribes, maintained spiritual sites tied to the geography, built social structures that governed disputes and preserved order. They were not nomadic, they were not primitive, they were a functioning civilization, but none of that mattered. Because the logic of expansion does not recognize civilization in the way it is practiced by those in the way. It recognizes civilization only in its own image, and this tribe did not look like America. Settler pressure intensified. Families moved west and encountered indigenous communities, and many did not see residents. They saw interference. Trespassers inside a future they had already claimed. Letters went to territorial governors. Petitions circulated. Demands rose for the government to do something about the Indian problem. The phrase exposes everything, not indigenous presence, not tribal nations. A problem. A problem is not negotiated with. It is solved. And solutions, in the context of expansion, are rarely gentle. The federal government faced a choice. It could recognize the tribe's sovereignty, draw enforceable boundaries, honor treaties that protected indigenous land from encroachment, or it could prioritize expansion. It chose expansion, not through open war, at least not at first. War was expensive, politically complicated. It risked turning tribes into martyrs and generating sympathy in parts of the country that still claimed moral objections to outright conquest. So the government chose process, a slow, bureaucratic, legally sanitized form of erasure, one that would make the tribe disappear, not through a sudden massacre, though violence would come, but through systems, through dependency, through fragmentation, through the quiet rewriting of their existence into something manageable, controllable, and eventually unnecessary. This was not a war. It was a policy. And policies do not require declarations. They do not require the kind of justification debated in public. They require paperwork, timelines, signatures, implementation. The first step was redefining the relationship. The tribe was no longer treated as an independent nation. It was described as a domestic dependent nation, a legal shape that sounded like recognition while functioning like restriction. It meant the tribe could not negotiate with outside powers, could not make agreements freely with other tribes, could not govern its own territory without oversight, sovereignty without power, recognition without respect. The second step was building dependence. The tribe's traditional economy, hunting, fishing, trade, was disrupted. Game populations declined as settlers hunted and cleared the land. Fishing rights narrowed. Trade networks weakened as neighboring tribes were displaced, absorbed, or forced into their own crises. A people that had been self-sufficient was pushed toward federal annuities, payments in exchange for land cessions, supplies in exchange for compliance. And once you are dependent, you are controllable. The third step was interference. The federal government did not deal with the tribe as a single unified body. It searched for fissures, it elevated factions, it found leaders willing to cooperate or desperate enough to consider it, individuals who could be persuaded, bribed or pressured into signing agreements others would never accept. Internal debates stopped being ordinary political disputes. They became survival conflicts. Every signature created resentment. Every negotiation deepened suspicion. Every agreement written in Washington turned into a fracture at home. Unity became harder, then unstable, then impossible. And without unity, resistance was not crushed by force. It was hollowed out from the inside. The tribe had not been conquered, not yet, but it had been made conquerable. Not through a decisive military defeat, but through a transformation. Of land into resource, of people into interference, of existence into an inconvenience the nation no longer felt obligated to tolerate. And once a people become a problem, the mechanisms of erasure do not arrive all at once. They start quietly, they start on paper, and in the next phase, the paper becomes a weapon. Erasure does not begin with violence, it begins with systems. Treaties that are not agreements, but extractions. Dependencies that look like aid, but function as control. Structures that promise civilization, but deliver dispossession. This was the first phase. Before armies, before forced marches, before the policies that would later be written into law. This was erasure through process, and it was devastatingly effective. The treaty system was the primary instrument. On paper, treaties suggested negotiation, two sovereign entities meeting to reach mutual agreement. But the reality was different. The tribe did not bargain from a position of strength. They bargained under pressure. Settlers moved deeper into their territory. Game populations declined. Federal agents made the consequence of refusal clear: sign or face intervention. So they signed. And with each treaty, land disappeared. Not all at once. That would have been too visible. Instead, it was incremental. One tract here, one hunting ground there. Boundaries redrawn again and again to accommodate expansion. The treaties were framed as fair exchange, land for annuities, territory for protection, sovereignty for peace. But annuities were delayed, protection did not arrive, and sovereignty once ceded was never returned. The tribe found itself bound to agreements it could not escape, and with each new treaty, the terms tightened. Because once you sign away part of your land, the precedent is set. The next negotiation begins at the new baseline. Then the baseline shifts again and again, until there is nothing left to negotiate. This was not diplomacy. It was extraction, dressed as process. The second instrument was dependency. For generations, the tribe had been self-sufficient. They hunted, fished, farmed, and traded. Their economy was seasonal but stable, their food sources diverse. Federal policy aimed to disrupt that stability. Hunting was restricted in areas the tribe had used for centuries. Fishing rights were contested. Trade with other tribes became harder as those tribes were displaced and as new territorial boundaries appeared where none had existed before. At the same time, the government offered annuities, regular payments in goods and money, blankets, tools, flour, items the tribe had once produced or acquired through its own networks, now delivered by someone else's schedule. It looked like assistance, but it functioned like a trap. Because the moment's survival depends on what is provided, autonomy shrinks. And when autonomy shrinks, leverage disappears. If the tribe resisted a new treaty, annuities could be withheld. If they resisted relocation, supplies could be delayed. What had been framed as generosity became a switch that could be flipped, reward for compliance, punishment for refusal. A people who had lived without federal support were pushed toward a point where they could not endure without it. The third instrument was the mission system. Christian missionaries arrived with promises of education and salvation. They built schools, taught English, offered religious instruction, and in doing so, they began dismantling the tribe's cultural foundations. Children were taken from their families and placed in mission schools, not always by force at first, though force would come later, but through persuasion, through the promise that education would create opportunity in the expanding American economy. But the education was not neutral, it was assimilation. Children were forbidden from speaking their language, punished for practicing traditional customs, taught that their ancestors' beliefs were primitive superstitions to be replaced with Christian truth. The missions did not just teach literacy, they taught shame. Shame for being indigenous, shame for ceremonies, shame for a worldview that had sustained the tribe for centuries. And shame, carried home and repeated across a generation, does not simply wound, it fractures identity. The fourth instrument was trade manipulation. The tribe had always traded with neighboring tribes and with European traders long before American expansion. Those networks were economic lifelines and diplomatic channels. As American influence grew, those networks were disrupted by design. Federal agents positioned themselves as intermediaries. They controlled access to goods the tribe needed, metal tools, firearms, cloth, and turned that access into leverage. Traders who dealt directly without approval could be fined or barred. Indigenous traders, moving between communities, were constrained by new boundaries and restrictions. The result was isolation. The tribe could no longer trade freely. It had to move through federal channels, and federal channels always extracted concessions. Access to markets in exchange for compliance, supplies in exchange for signatures. Trade, once a source of autonomy, became another form of dependency. The fifth instrument was leadership interference. The tribe had its own governance, chiefs, councils, decision-making rooted in tradition and consensus. Federal agents did not respect those structures. They identified individuals who would cooperate, then rewarded them. Preferential treatment, gifts, recognition, status, and then those individuals were presented as the tribe's official leaders. Traditional leaders who resisted found their authority undermined by federally favored chiefs who could sign treaties without true consensus. Decisions that should have required unity were pulled apart by competing claims of legitimacy. Internal disagreements that might once have been resolved through traditional processes became unsolvable. because the federal government recognized only the leadership it had helped manufacture. Unity fractured, not because the tribe was weak, but because outside forces learned how to press on existing seams until they split. The sixth instrument was alcohol. Traders introduced it. Federal agents permitted it, and it spread through indigenous communities under the weight of dispossession, dependency, and cultural pressure. Alcohol had not been part of the tribe's culture, but in conditions of stress and erosion, it became a coping mechanism and then a tool. Traders extended credit, debt accumulated, and debt became leverage. Leaders could be pushed towards signatures. Communities could be pulled into agreements they did not fully control. Alcohol did not simply harm individuals, it destabilized the collective. It weakened social structures. It made coordinated resistance harder. The seventh instrument was debt itself. As the tribe became more reliant on annuities and trade goods, it was drawn into financial arrangements it did not fully understand. Debts were recorded. Interest grew. And when payments were missed, often because annuities were delayed, land could be seized as compensation. This was not theft in the way people imagine theft. It was legal dispossession, documented, processed, justified in courts the tribe could not access, and through rules they had not written. By the time the tribe understood what was happening, territory had already been transferred to creditors, to trading companies, to settlers purchasing debt-encumbered land at rates the tribe could never repay. All of this happened before a single soldier arrived to force removal at gunpoint. This was the first phase of erasure. Quiet, procedural, relentless. Treaties that extracted land, dependency that eliminated autonomy, missions that dismantled culture, trade manipulation that isolated economies, leadership interference that fractured governance, alcohol and debt that destabilized communities. Each instrument alone might have been survivable. Together, they were designed to make survival collapse from the inside. And once a people are destabilized from within, external force no longer needs to announce itself, it only needs to arrive. Unity is a civilization's greatest defense and its greatest vulnerability, because unity depends on trust, shared purpose, the belief that survival requires staying together. And all of that can be broken, not through conquest, through division, by turning a people inward, by making internal fractures so deep that no external enemy is needed to finish what has already begun. This was the strategy applied to the tribe, not suddenly, not clumsily, carefully, methodically, by identifying existing tensions and pressing on them until they became unbridgeable. Every society has factions, differences of opinion, competing visions for the future. The tribe was no exception. There were those who believed accommodation with the Americans was possible, that signing treaties and adopting certain practices could buy time, buy stability, allow the tribe to survive in a world that was changing faster than any generation had known. And there were those who believed accommodation was surrender, that every concession weakened them, that resistance, costly, uncertain, even doomed, was the only way to preserve identity. Both perspectives were rooted in survival. Both were sincere. Both carried logic. Federal agents did not treat them as legitimate positions. They treated them as levers. The accommodationists were rewarded, invited into negotiations, offered gifts, given better annuities. Their words were elevated in federal correspondence. They were described as the reasonable faction, the progressive ones, the leaders the government could work with. The resistors were sidelined, excluded from negotiations, their annuities delayed, their leaders labeled hostiles or troublemakers. They were framed as obstacles to peace, the reason the tribe could not move forward. This was not a misunderstanding. It was design. Because once you create rival centers of legitimacy, the tribe stops focusing on the external threat. It starts focusing on itself. The accommodationists accuse the resistors of being reckless, of refusing to see reality, of placing pride above survival. The resistors accused the accommodationists of betrayal, of trading their people's future for personal advantage, of signing away what could not be replaced. Both accusations contained slivers of truth, and both dug the trench deeper. Federal agents exploited that divide without hesitation. They negotiated with accommodationist leaders who did not have the authority to speak for the entire tribe. When resistors rejected those treaties, the government declared them binding anyway. A legal fiction took hold, a treaty signed by a minority, enforced as if it represented consensus. And once that fiction existed on paper, it could be used as fact. Traditional governance required consensus. Decisions were meant to be collective. Leaders were not supposed to act unilaterally on matters of land and survival, but the federal government did not respect that process. It recognized only the leaders it could use. So when an accommodationist chief signed a treaty ceding land, the government treated it as legitimate, even when most of the tribe opposed it. The resistors protested, refused to leave the ceded territory, declared the treaty invalid. But declarations did not stop surveyors. Surveyors did not stop settlers. And once settlers arrived, the argument over legitimacy became irrelevant. The land, regardless of who claimed it, was gone. The division did not remain political. It became personal. Families split along factional lines. Brothers who disagreed about accommodation stopped speaking. Elders who had held the tribe together through generations found their authority challenged by younger leaders aligned with federal recognition. Marriages strained. Children were caught between parents with opposing views. Kinship networks, the social foundation of the tribe, began to crack, because when politics enters the family, there is no safe ground left. Territorial splits followed. Some members, believing accommodation was the only remaining option, accepted relocation offers. They moved to designated territories and tried to rebuild with what they could carry. Others refused, stayed on ancestral land, resisted every attempt to remove them. The tribe, once unified, became geographically fragmented. Some in one territory, some in another, some scattered across land they could no longer protect with law or treaty. Fragmentation made collective action impossible. A unified tribe could negotiate from strength. A divided tribe could be played against itself. Agreements could be extracted from whichever group was most desperate. Resistance could be isolated, then weakened, then crushed without needing to confront the whole. Federal agents weaponized negotiation itself. They did not negotiate with a people. They negotiated with factions, offered different terms to different groups, made promises to one side that contradicted promises made to the other. This ensured that no agreement could produce unity. Someone would always feel deceived, and deception breeds resentment. Resentment hardens into conflict. Conflict drains everything. The most insidious consequence was identity erosion. The tribe had always defined itself through shared language, ceremonies, stories, and connection to land. But as divisions deepened, even those foundations began to splinter. Accommodationists adopted American customs, settler clothing, English in public, mission schooling for their children, not always out of desire to abandon their culture, but because they believed adaptation was survival. Resistors saw it differently. They held to traditional practices, refused English, rejected Christianity, protected ceremonies in secrecy. Both groups still called themselves the tribe, but they no longer agreed on what that meant. Was identity blood, language, territory, resistance? Or was it the ability to adapt and endure inside an expanding nation? There was no consensus, and without consensus, there was no unified identity. Children born into this fracture inherited it like air. They watched elders argue, families split, leaders discredited. They grew up without a clear sense of who they were, only a clear sense of what was breaking. Some tried to bridge the divide. Elders pleaded for unity. Leaders warned that internal conflict was exactly what the federal government wanted. But by then, Trust had been damaged beyond repair. Wounds had been opened that could not be closed by appeals to shared ancestry. The tribe lost its unified voice, and without a unified voice, it could not speak for itself, could not resist together, could not negotiate as equals. Federal agents no longer needed to suppress the tribe. The tribe was suppressing itself. Every treaty negotiation became a battleground, not between the tribe and the government, but between factions inside the tribe. Every decision about land, relocation, or culture triggered conflict, and while the tribe tore itself apart from within, American expansion continued. Settlers moved onto ceded land. Boundaries were redrawn. New treaties were signed by whoever was willing or able to sign them. The resistors, isolated and outnumbered, could do little but watch their world dismantled piece by piece. The accommodationists, having compromised again and again in hopes of securing survival, discovered that survival was being measured in losses. Both factions lost, not because they were weak, because they had been divided, and a divided people cannot withstand what comes next. There comes a moment when process ends and force begins, when treaties are no longer negotiated but dictated, when relocation is no longer voluntary but mandatory, when systems designed to destabilize a people give way to mechanisms designed to remove them. For this tribe, that moment did not arrive as a surprise. It arrived as an inevitability. The groundwork had already been laid. The tribe had been fragmented, made dependent, isolated politically and economically. Their land had been ceded piece by piece through treaties signed under pressure and enforced without protection. But land cessions were not enough, because the tribe was still there, still occupying territory promised to settlers, still existing in spaces American expansion demanded. So removal became policy, not through a single dramatic proclamation, but through a chain of legal decisions, executive orders, and congressional acts that turned displacement from strategy into law. The Indian Removal Act was the clearest expression of that shift. It was framed as benevolent, moving tribes west to preserve their way of life away from settler encroachment. But benevolence was never the point. The point was clearance, opening land for American settlement, eliminating indigenous presence from regions designated for expansion. The tribe, like others, was offered a choice that was not a choice: relocate voluntarily or be removed by force. Some chose to leave. Families who saw no future in resistance, who believed compliance might at least preserve life, if not everything else. They gathered what they could carry and said goodbye to burial grounds, sacred sites, and land their ancestors had lived on for generations, and they walked west. Others refused. They pointed to treaties guaranteeing their land. They argued that removal violated agreements the federal government itself had signed. They were correct. The treaties were still valid, legally binding, but legality is meaningless without enforcement, and the government had no intention of enforcing promises that obstructed expansion. So the treaties were broken. Not with formal declarations, not with public admissions of violation, but through actions that made them irrelevant. Federal agents arrived with new demands, new boundaries, new deadlines. Then soldiers followed, not to negotiate, to enforce. Military escorts were presented as necessary protection. The roads west were dangerous. The tribe was told. Bandits, harsh terrain, uncertainty. They needed supervision for their own safety, but the soldiers were not there to protect them. They were there to ensure they left and did not return. Families were given weeks to prepare, sometimes days. They were told to bring only what they could carry. Homes were abandoned, livestock left behind, crops unharvested. Everything built over generations, gone in a single season. The march west was not a journey, it was an ordeal. Hundreds of miles, winter cold, summer heat, inadequate supplies, insufficient food, no medical care. Children died along the route. Elders collapsed. The sick were left behind when they could not keep pace. Those who survived arrived in territories they did not know, land promised as theirs, yet already contested by other displaced tribes forced into the same confined spaces. This was not relocation. It was exile. But removal was only one half of the policy. The other half was making sure the tribe could never return, and that required erasing not only their presence, but their claim to ever having been there. Land confiscation was formalized through legal mechanisms. Courts reduced indigenous rights to something temporary, occupancy that could be extinguished by federal authority. The tribe's territory was surveyed, divided into plots, sold to settlers. Within years, farms and towns rose where the tribe had lived for centuries, and with the land went the names. Rivers the tribe had named were renamed. Mountains were given English designations. Villages that had existed for generations disappeared from maps, replaced by settler townships. The geography itself was rewritten, as if the tribe had never been there. Cultural bans followed. The government, having removed the tribe from their land, moved to remove their culture from public life. Ceremonies were outlawed, declared pagan practices incompatible with civilization. Spiritual leaders who continued were arrested. Sacred objects were confiscated. Rituals that had sustained identity for centuries were driven underground. Language was targeted next. Children were taken from their families and placed in government-run boarding schools with an explicit goal: assimilation. The stated aim was to sever what connected them to their people. Students were forbidden from speaking their language, punished for practicing traditions, haircut, clothing replaced, names changed into English equivalents. These schools were not neutral institutions, they were erasure facilities designed to sever the link between children and heritage, to produce a generation that would not remember what had been taken. Some children internalized the shame. They stopped speaking their language even at home, rejected their culture because they had been trained to see it as inferior. Others resisted, speaking in whispers, holding on to stories, passing them to younger siblings when teachers were not listening. But resistance in isolation is exhausting, and many simply broke. Renaming extended beyond individuals. The tribe itself was reclassified, split into administrative categories, some labeled as one band, others as another. Legal distinctions that had never existed were created to fragment them further. Federal records began describing them not as a unified people, but as scattered groups without a collective identity. It became easier to deny claims, easier to argue that the tribe, as a political entity, no longer existed. Legal erasure followed as the final pressure. Treaties that had once recognized sovereignty were reinterpreted. Court rulings treated indigenous nations not as true sovereigns, but as domestic dependents. Arrangements that could be modified, limited, dissolved. The tribe's legal existence, already fragile, was dismantled piece by piece. They were not a nation, not a people with enforceable rights. They were wards, dependents, subjects, and subjects do not have power to refuse. Removal became generational trauma. Children who survived the schools grew up disconnected from language, culture, land. They had children who knew even less. Stories that should have been passed down went silent. Ceremonies faded. Sacred sites became distant, inaccessible, forgotten by those who had never seen them. A civilization that had once been unified was now scattered across unfamiliar territories, geographically displaced, culturally suppressed, legally diminished. But they were not extinct. Scattered, fragmented, traumatized, not extinct. And what survives in fragments can still remember what it once was, which is exactly why the next phase was not just about removing bodies, it was about making memory itself disappear. Disappearance is not the same as extinction. A people can be removed from their land, stripped of legal status, banned from practicing their culture, and still survive. Not intact, not whole, but alive. This tribe did not vanish after removal. They did not fade quietly into history the way American expansion wanted them to. But what survived was fractured, scattered across territories they had never chosen, living inside communities that bore no resemblance to what had been taken. Displaced communities formed in the wake of forced relocation. Families who had walked the same brutal routes west clustered together, not by preference, but by necessity. Strangers became neighbors because they carried the same trauma, the same loss. These were not traditional villages. There were no familiar ceremonial grounds, no sacred geography that anchored identity, only makeshift settlements on land the federal government had deemed suitable, which often meant land no one else wanted. Harsh terrain, poor soil, limited water, places where survival required constant labor and offered little in return. But survival was the point, and so they survived. They rebuilt what they could, raised shelters, planted crops in unfamiliar ground, learned new landscapes with the urgency of people who had no alternative. Yet nothing felt right. The plants were different. The seasons moved with unfamiliar rhythms. Rivers carried different names and flowed in directions that did not match the stories. Everything was wrong, and there was no going back. Memory became fragmented. The elders who had lived on the original land held the clearest recollections. They remembered mountains by their true names, the rivers where ancestors had fished, the valleys where ceremonies had been performed. They told their children what was lost, tried to pass down knowledge of a world that no longer existed. But memory, separated from place, turns abstract. Children heard the stories but could not see the land, could not touch the water, could not stand where their ancestors had stood. The stories remained, but the connection weakened, like a thread stretched too far to hold. And with each generation details slipped away, the exact steps of a ceremony, the full verses of a song, the meaning behind a symbol, small erasures that accumulated into vast gaps. Language loss accelerated. Boarding schools had done what they were built to do. Children returned speaking English, ashamed of their native tongue, uncertain how to teach it to their own children, even if they wanted to. Some parents made a painful decision: stop speaking the language entirely. They believed English was the key to survival, that holding to the old ways would only make the next generation's life harder. It was an act of love and an act of erasure. Others tried to preserve the language in secret, spoke it at home when no one was listening, taught vocabulary in whispers. But a language needs more than words to survive. It needs daily use, context, a community that carries it naturally. Those conditions no longer existed. By the third generation after removal, most spoke only English. A language that had carried knowledge for centuries was reduced to fragments, elders who still remembered scattered words surviving inside families like embers. But a language in fragments is not a living language. It is a ghost. Oral history became the tribe's primary archive. There were no official chronicles they could trust, no stable records that belonged to them. Everything depended on memory, passed from one generation to the next. Elders carried the stories, origins, migrations, leaders who resisted, treaties broken, routes walked during removal. They told these stories to anyone willing to listen, and some did. Grandchildren who wanted to understand the ache they had inherited, the absence they could feel but could not name. But oral history is fragile. It depends on unbroken chains, and those chains were broken again and again, by early deaths, by families scattered across regions, by children taken to schools and never returned. Each break meant stories lost forever. Ceremonies survived in hiding. Federal bans remained. Traditional spirituality was treated as illegal. Performing ceremonies could mean arrest, so rituals went underground, held in remote places at night with lookouts posted to warn of approaching authorities. Sacred objects were hidden and passed down quietly, kept where outsiders would not think to look. The ceremonies continued, but often incomplete. Elements were forgotten. Leaders who knew protocols died. What survived became adaptation, reconstruction, built from partial memory. Sacred, yes, but changed by the pressure of survival. Names became unmoored from nations. Individuals carried tribal names. Family names passed down through generations. But those names no longer connected to a recognized political entity. Federal records listed them as individuals, not as members of a sovereign nation. Their affiliation appeared as history, as past tense, as if the tribe had already ceased to exist, and legally it had been treated that way. The nation dissolved, the treaties voided, the territory taken. What remained were people with names tied to a political identity that no longer had standing in the world that governed them. Trauma became inheritance. The children of those who survived removal grew up around wounds that were never fully spoken, grief that could not be processed, rage that could not be safely expressed. The trauma was not explained. It was simply present, in the silence, in the way elders stared at nothing, in stories that ended abruptly, in the refusal to speak about certain places or years. Children absorbed it not as memory. They had not walked the route themselves, but as atmosphere, as absence, as the sense that something essential had been taken and no one had the words to retrieve it, and they passed that absence on. Trauma without context, pain without language, grief inherited across generations. In official history, the tribe was reduced to footnotes. Textbooks mentioned them briefly, one of many tribes relocated during expansion, a paragraph, sometimes a sentence. Removal framed as inevitable, regrettable perhaps, but necessary, a tragic consequence of progress. The complexity was erased, treaties broken, promises made and violated, policies designed to fragment and destroy. None of it survived intact in the sanctioned narrative. They were simply removed and then forgotten. Anthropologists sometimes studied what remained, recorded stories, collected vocabulary, documented fragments of culture, but often they approached the tribe as if it were already gone, preserving artifacts of a dead civilization instead of engaging a living people still struggling to endure. Museums acquired tribal objects, displayed them behind glass, labeled them as relics from a vanished culture, and the tribe, still alive, watched sacred items treated as curiosities. What survived was not the tribe as it had been. It was fragments, pieces of memory, partial language, hidden ceremonies, scattered families, inherited trauma. But fragments are not nothing. They are proof of existence, evidence that something whole once stood here. And fragments, gathered carefully, can sometimes be arranged into more than an archive. They can become a return, an identity remembering what it once was. History is not what happened. It is what was recorded, what was preserved, what was deemed worth remembering. And what was deemed worth remembering was decided by those who controlled the records. The story of this tribe's removal did not fade by accident. It was erased deliberately, through the language used to describe it, through the narratives built around it, through the quiet exclusion of perspectives that would complicate the story America wanted to tell about itself. The erasure began with administrative language. Federal documents did not call removal displacement. They called it relocation, not theft, but land acquisition, not cultural destruction, but civilization programs. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, designed to obscure reality behind procedure. Treaties were described as negotiated, even when signed under coercion. Resistance was pacified, even when crushed by force. Starvation on the road was reduced to inadequate provisions, as if suffering were a logistical inconvenience rather than human collapse. Administrative language made atrocity sound like policy. And policy sounds neutral, rational, necessary. A report describing removal did not mention families torn apart, children dying on winter roads, elders collapsing from exhaustion. It mentioned relocation logistics, transportation challenges, resource allocation. Suffering vanished in the paperwork, and what vanishes in paperwork vanishes in history. The narrative of peaceful expansion did the rest. America was not supposed to be a nation built on conquest. It was supposed to be built on settlement, pioneers bringing civilization into empty wilderness. Indigenous peoples made that story impossible because the land was not empty. So the story adjusted. Indigenous nations were reframed, not as inhabitants being dispossessed, but as obstacles being managed, sometimes even for their own benefit. Removal was presented as humanitarian. Tribes were being moved away from settlers who threatened them, given new land where they could live undisturbed, protected from the chaos of frontier contact. This framing stripped agency. It turned a sovereign people into helpless figures requiring federal intervention, not a nation resisting forced dispossession. It also erased responsibility. If removal was for the tribe's protection, then the federal government was not the aggressor. It was the savior. And saviors do not commit atrocities. They make difficult but necessary decisions. Civilizing narratives reinforced the same logic. Expansion was not about taking land, it was about spreading civilization, bringing progress to people framed as primitive. The tribe's way of life was labeled inferior. Hunting and seasonal movement were uncivilized. Communal landholding was inefficient. Spiritual practices were superstition. Once a culture is framed as backward, destroying it can be described as improvement, not erasure, but elevation. Textbooks absorbed this framing almost completely. Children were taught westward expansion as heroic, settlers as brave pioneers, the continent as wilderness transformed into prosperity. Indigenous peoples appeared briefly, part of the landscape, a complication to be resolved. Their disappearance treated as regrettable, perhaps, but inevitable. Textbooks did not explain how removal was engineered. They did not dwell on broken treaties, coerced negotiations, or enforcement by soldiers. They did not include the tribe's voice. Instead, removal was reduced to a sentence. Many tribes were relocated to territories in the West. Passive voice, no actors, no decision-makers, no accountability, just something that happened. The perspectives that would have disrupted this narrative were systematically excluded. The tribe's account of removal rarely appeared in official histories. Letters protesting treaty violations were not centered in archives. Testimonies were not recorded on equal footing. What the tribe said, what they feared, what they lost, these details did not become the backbone of the historical record. Because official history was written largely by federal agents, military officers, administrators, and later, historians trained to treat government archives as primary truth. And those archives did not preserve the voices of the removed as carefully as they preserved the voices of the removers. When indigenous perspectives did appear, they often arrived filtered through translators, missionaries, or government intermediaries, edited, interpreted, framed to fit the existing storyline. A leader condemning removal might be summarized as expressing concerns. A community defending itself might be labeled unrest. The meaning was softened, the emotion flattened, the perspective neutralized. Victory framing ensured the nation always appeared as the protagonist. Maps showed the United States expanding, territory acquired, borders pushed west. Each acquisition presented as progress, as achievement. The costs were not mapped. Textbooks showed borders growing. They did not show indigenous territories shrinking. They did not chart the peoples displaced, the languages silenced, the cultures driven underground. Because those losses were not treated as losses, they were treated as the price of progress, necessary, unfortunate, and ultimately forgettable. The silence of records may have been the most effective weapon of all. Much of what happened during removal was never documented in ways that would later be legible as atrocity. Oral promises were not recorded. Assurances given by agents vanished when leadership changed. Suffering on forced marches was not catalogued with the same care as supplies and routes. And what is not documented cannot be proven, cannot be taught, cannot be defended against denial. A century later, historians found archives filled with government correspondence, military reports, administrative memos, an overwhelming weight of paper that told only one side of the story. The tribe's perspective survived as fragments, scattered oral histories, a handful of letters saved by chance, testimonies recorded second-hand by outsiders sympathetic enough to write them down. But fragments cannot compete with archives, so the official version became the dominant version. Erasure through documentation was the final mechanism. Control what is recorded, control what is preserved, control what is accessible. Records that exposed contradiction were buried. Reports that documented suffering were filed away, forgotten, or rendered unreadable by distance and disinterest. What remained most visible was a sanitized account, expansion as inevitable, removal as unfortunate but necessary, government as acting in good faith inside a difficult situation. Textbooks cited those sources, historians relied on them, teachers taught from them, and generations inherited a version of the past where the tribe appeared only as a passing reference, a footnote acknowledging that indigenous peoples had once lived where America now stood. Their sovereignty was erased, their resistance erased, their forced removal softened into relocation, their cultural destruction reframed as civilization, and the mechanisms that made it possible, the deliberate choices, the strategies, the policies, became invisible. History was written not to remember what happened, but to justify what was done, and what is justified becomes acceptable, repeatable, forgotten as atrocity, and remembered only as progress. There is a phrase repeated in textbooks, museums, and documentaries. They disappeared. Not displaced, not removed, not destroyed, disappeared. As if the tribe simply faded away, as if absence were natural, inevitable, a quiet vanishing that required no explanation and implicated no one. This is the myth of extinction. And it is a lie. The tribe did not disappear. They were made to disappear from the national narrative, erased from maps, removed from legal recognition, excluded from the story America told about itself. But they were still alive, living in displaced communities, speaking what remained of their language, practicing ceremonies in secrecy, passing down stories to children who carried names that no longer appeared where names were made official. They existed. America chose to pretend they did not. Museums played a central role in building this myth. Tribal artifacts were collected, sometimes purchased, often taken, and displayed behind glass. Clothing, tools, ceremonial objects, sacred items that should never have been separated from the communities that held them. And they were presented as relics, evidence of a culture that once existed. Past tense, frozen, safe. Labels described the tribe in language reserved for the dead. The tribe inhabited this region. They practiced these ceremonies. Their culture was characterized by everything framed as finished, everything stripped of continuity. Visitors absorbed the message without being told directly. This culture is extinct. These people are gone. What remains are objects to study, not a living community to respect. The tribe, still alive and trying to protect what was left, was erased by institutions claiming to honor them. Frozen cultures became the dominant representation. When indigenous peoples appeared in popular media, they were shown in traditional dress, living in pre-contact conditions, performing rituals as if history had paused around them centuries ago. There was no room for adaptation. No acknowledgement of survival under pressure, no recognition that being forced to change is not the same as choosing to vanish. Indigenous people were permitted to exist in the American imagination only as historical figures, distant, unchanging, exotic. And the moment they appeared in modern clothing, speaking English, living in contemporary communities, they were treated as no longer authentic. Because in the American imagination, authenticity required being frozen, being dead. Tourist versions reinforced the same illusion. Regions where the tribe had once lived built tourism around indigenous history, historical markers, reenactments, local museums. The past was packaged into something marketable, romantic, tragic, distant. Tourists learned about noble warriors and spiritual harmony with nature, colorful ceremonies, beautiful craftsmanship. They did not learn about forced removal, broken treaties, cultural bans, boarding schools, generational trauma, ongoing battles for recognition. The tribe became an attraction, a way to sell rich indigenous heritage, while ignoring the indigenous people still living with what that heritage cost. And when actual tribal members tried to correct the narrative, they were often dismissed, not always with open hostility, but with a quieter disbelief, told they were not real representatives of the culture, that they did not look indigenous enough, did not speak the language well enough, did not fit the romantic image outsiders came to consume. Stereotypes became the only acceptable form of presence. Feathers, war paint, stoic expressions, mystical wisdom about nature. Any indigenous person who did not conform to these images was treated as an imitation, inauthentic, diluted, suspect. But the tribe's descendants wore modern clothing because they lived in the modern world. They spoke English because their language had been systematically suppressed. They practiced adapted ceremonies because original forms had been banned, interrupted, partially forgotten under punishment and surveillance. None of that was framed as survival. It was framed as loss of authenticity. And once you are declared inauthentic, your claims become easier to dismiss. Your history becomes negotiable. Your very existence becomes something outsiders feel entitled to debate. Past tense framing dominated everything: educational materials, documentary narration, museum placards. The tribe was known for, not is known for. They lived in this region, not they were removed from this region. Their culture emphasized, not their culture continues. Past tense made extinction a linguistic fact, and linguistic fact, repeated long enough, becomes accepted truth. Children learned indigenous peoples as part of America's past, something finished, something resolved, something that no longer placed demands on the present. And if the tribe was not part of the present, then it had no claims on the present. No rights to recognize, no promises to honor, no grievances to address. Living people were ignored by design. Tribal members who asserted their continued existence were met with disbelief or dismissal. When they filed legal claims for treaty violations, they were told those treaties applied to a tribe that no longer existed. When they demanded recognition, they were told they had been dissolved. When they asked for sacred objects returned, they were told those objects were now historical artifacts belonging to the public. Extinction was useful. It was politically convenient, because acknowledging survival would mean acknowledging broken promises, stolen land, ongoing injustice. So the myth persisted, reinforced through education, media, and institutional treatment. The lie of extinction served a purpose. It allowed America to claim indigenous history as heritage without confronting indigenous presence as reality. It allowed museums to profit from indigenous culture without consulting indigenous communities. It allowed textbooks to describe removal without acknowledging descendants. It allowed tourists to consume indigenous imagery without encountering indigenous people. The lie made erasure feel complete, not only physical removal from land, not only legal dissolution of sovereignty, but narrative extinction, the assertion that the tribe simply no longer existed. For many Americans, that assertion became fact. They genuinely believed the tribe had disappeared, that what happened was tragic history, regrettable but finished. They did not know the tribe's descendants were still fighting for recognition, still protecting what fragments remained, still insisting on their existence against a nation that had already written them out. The myth of extinction was not accidental. It was constructed through language, through institutions, through the systematic exclusion of living indigenous voices from their own story. And it endures because the truth demands something uncomfortable. The tribe did not disappear. They were erased. And erasure is not just history. It is policy that continues to echo forward. Erasure is not something that happened. It is something that continues. The tribe was removed generations ago. Treaties were broken in the 1800s. Children were taken to boarding schools decades past. Language was suppressed. Culture was banned. People were scattered. All of that is history. But the effects are not, because erasure does not end when policies stop. It persists in identities fractured by those policies, in legal battles still being fought, in land that was never returned, in cultural knowledge that must be rebuilt from fragments, one careful piece at a time. The tribe's descendants live with erasure every day, not as distant memory, but as lived reality. Modern identity loss is one of the most enduring consequences. Children who survived boarding schools came home disconnected. They did not speak the language fluently, did not know ceremonies, did not hold the stories the way their grandparents held them. They raised children who knew even less, who grew up hearing they were indigenous, but without a clear sense of what that meant. No language to speak, no ceremonies to enter, no community structures strong enough to carry what had been interrupted. By the third and fourth generations, many descendants did not even know they belonged to the tribe. Family histories were buried, names were anglicized, connections were severed on purpose, then lost by time. Some discovered heritage accidentally, through genealogy research, family secrets revealed late in life, DNA tests pointing toward ancestry their parents never mentioned. And when they tried to reconnect, they found a culture surviving mostly in fragments, a language spoken by a handful of elders, ceremonies partially reconstructed, communities scattered across states without a stable center. Reconnection is not a simple return. It is reconstruction from absence, learning what was taken, accepting that some things cannot be fully recovered, not because they lacked value, but because they were deliberately targeted for destruction. Legal battles continue. Descendants have spent generations fighting for recognition, for acknowledgement that they still exist, that treaties signed with their ancestors should still matter. But courts have repeatedly ruled against them, declared the tribe legally dissolved, treated removal as an end point that extinguished claims, asserted that descendants do not inherit the rights their ancestors were promised, and every challenge carries the same demand: prove continuous existence, demonstrate unbroken connection, produce documentation that often was never created or was destroyed, buried or excluded by the very systems that engineered the erasure. The burden is nearly impossible by design, because if you were erased from the record, how do you prove you were there? Land disputes persist. The territory the tribe was removed from is now privately owned. Towns, farms, parks, properties layered through generations. No one living there today took the land directly, but they benefit from the taking. Descendants have filed claims, argued that land was never legally ceded, that removal violated treaties the government signed, but restitution would require unraveling property transfers and confronting the foundation beneath everyday normal life. It would require acknowledging that entire communities sit on land taken by force and paperwork, so claims are denied, settled for compensation that amounts to pennies per acre, or dismissed as historically moot. The land remains gone, and with it, sacred sites, burial grounds, places where identity was anchored not by ideas but by geography. Cultural revival pushes against this legacy. Tribal members work to preserve what remains, teaching language to children raised in English, recording elders before they are gone, reconstructing ceremonies from partial memory and archived notes. But revival is not restoration. You cannot fully recover what was deliberately destroyed. The language being taught is careful and necessary, but it is often a reconstruction, scholarly, pieced together, missing the natural continuity that comes from daily use across generations. The ceremonies being performed are adaptations, built from memory, from fragments, from descriptions recorded by outsiders long after the disruption began. Some context cannot be recreated. Some knowledge ended when the last person who carried it died. Revival is essential, and it is painful, because it brings every gap into view, every missing name, every song with a lost verse, every tradition that ends mid-sentence. Historical reckoning has begun in some places. Institutions acknowledge roles they played. Churches issue apologies for boarding schools. Museums return sacred objects. Universities confront foundations tied to indigenous displacement. But acknowledgement without restitution is incomplete. Apologies without structural change remain symbolic. The tribe's descendants do not need symbolism. They need recognition, sovereignty, access to sacred sites now fenced, privatized, controlled. They need the lie of extinction to end, for textbooks to change, for their living presence to be treated as reality instead of inconvenience. Memory has become a form of power. For generations, the tribe's story was told by others. Federal agents, historians, anthropologists, outsiders filtering indigenous experience through colonial frameworks. Now descendants are reclaiming narrative space, writing their own histories, speaking in their own voices, insisting their perspective is not a supplement, but the center. That insistence threatens comfortable stories, because when the erased speak, the myth collapses. They do not describe removal as unfortunate necessity. They describe it as deliberate policy. They do not treat boarding schools as education. They name them as cultural destruction. They do not accept that legal dissolution means disappearance, and their refusal forces confrontation with what has been avoided. History is being weaponized in both directions. Some use the past to justify erasure, to argue removal happened long ago and cannot be undone, that treaties were products of their time, that acknowledging ongoing harm raises impossible questions about land ownership and national legitimacy. Others use history to demand justice, to show promises were made and broken, that erasure was planned, that consequences persist and must be addressed. Both sides understand the same truth. History is not neutral, it is a tool, and whoever controls the narrative controls what can be claimed, demanded, or denied. The unfinished erasure is the reality that matters most. The tribe was not fully destroyed. Fragments survived, language held by elders, ceremonies practiced in secrecy, stories carried forward despite suppression, and those fragments are growing. New generations are reconnecting, learning, organizing, fighting for recognition, refusing the myth of extinction. The erasure that began centuries ago is still being resisted, and that resistance is why this history matters, not only because it happened, but because it is still happening, still contested, still shaping who is seen, who is believed, who is allowed to exist. And as long as erasure continues, the story is not over. They were not erased because they vanished. They were erased so the nation could expand as if they had. This tribe did not disappear into history. They were removed from it, systematically, deliberately, through policies designed not just to take their land, but to eliminate their existence from the national story. Treaties that were broken, dependencies that were engineered, divisions that were manufactured, removals that were enforced, cultures that were banned, identities that were fractured, narratives that were rewritten. Every step calculated, every mechanism designed to make a people disappear without anyone having to acknowledge what was being done. History remembers conquest, the battles, the generals, the territorial expansions that appear on maps as national achievement. It rarely remembers the systems that made conquest possible, the administrative language that turned displacement into relocation, the legal frameworks that dissolved sovereignty, the educational institutions that severed children from culture, the documentation that erased perspectives, the narratives that framed extinction as inevitability. These systems did not vanish with the policies that created them. They persist in the identities still fractured, the languages still lost, the land still unceded, the recognition still denied. The tribe was not destroyed, but they were made invisible, and invisibility, in history, is its own form of death. Except they refused to die. Fragments survived, memory persisted, descendants reconnected, and the erasure that was meant to be final remains unfinished, because some stories refuse to stay buried, some peoples refuse to be footnotes, some truths demand to be spoken, even when the nation built on their silence would prefer they remain hidden. This is one of those truths. If you want the histories that were never meant to be visible, the stories erased from textbooks, the perspectives excluded from the official narrative, subscribe to Fragments of History. Leave a like if this story challenged what you thought you knew, and share it, because erasure only succeeds when we stop remembering.